Hi there. My name is Lucas Weiss, and I am the host of the Weesesports Quarantine Chronicles. For today's episode, I'm joined by Steve McAllister. Steve is the current president of Sports Media Canada, with previous stops at the National Hockey League Players Association, Tennis Canada, Yahoo Sports, and the Globe and Mail. In this episode, I chat with Steve about his journey into sports media, evaluating talent, building and cultivating relationships with colleagues in the industry, as well as his advice for young journalists. The Weesports Quarantine Chronicles is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So make sure to like, rate, watch, and subscribe to all three of those channels. This is episode 32 of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. All right, on today's episode of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles, I am joined by Steve McAllister. He is a communications and media expert specialist. He's worked at a bunch of different places in sports media and communications. Currently the president of Sport Media Canada, as well as the partner at Hip Check Media. Steve, welcome to the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. How are you?
Great, Lucas. Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on the WSC.
right on. And hopefully the quarantine part of it will drop off once we get back to normal. So it's just the Weesports Chronicles. But who knows these days in terms of where we're going. But I gotta say off the top, Steve, I've had a lot of athletes on. I've had few sports media figures on, but you're someone who's mainly in the communication side. So I'm really interested in hearing your perspective, because I think in people that, work in communications and public relations as it pertains to sports, a lot of those similar traits and skills apply to people who work in sports media.
Yeah, that's a great point, Lucas. And I think it probably applies even more so today, because with digital media, obviously the work that you're doing with this podcast and what we've seen with Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram and now TikTok and Snapchat, it's a big part of a communication person's job now is storytelling, and to combine that with the fact, Lucas, as you know, because you're a young person trying to get your foot in the door in this sports media industry, is that there aren't the opportunities that there were when I started my career 39 years ago. So the good thing is, and we've seen it with professional sports teams and leagues, is that there are opportunities for young people like yourself who are talented. If you're not going to get a chance to work for a mainstream media outlet, that there are opportunities to work at the club or league level doing that storytelling.
For sure. And like you said, there's a lot of different ways to tell stories, because when you first got into business, print was certainly the dominant form. And I've had the pleasure of having many writers on who started out in print and then transitioned over to digital outlets like The Athletic. And, for you, and then nowadays it's, the digital and the social media aspect to tell the stories, especially at the league level, where a lot of these teams now are exploring different forms of storytelling, whether it's TikTok, whether it's Snapchat. But I'm just sort of curious, Steve, how do you know when a trend is going to stick? Because I feel like a lot, especially where we are now, a lot of young people and young journalists are trying to figure out, okay, I'm doing TikTok, I'm doing Twitter, I'm doing all these different things. But how do you define, when something becomes a trend in sports media?
Yeah, I'm not going to lie, Lucas. I think it's really difficult. It's funny, when I was working at Yahoo back around 2013, 2014, we used to talk a lot about podcasts and that, we really thought part of the future of sports media was going to be in podcasting. And it's almost like podcasting was like the Slinky. It was it was the flavor of the month for a couple of months, and all of a sudden podcasts dropped off the map. And what we've really seen during the COVID-19 pandemic is it's almost like there's been it seems silly to say this, but there's been a resurrection of the podcast. Mm-hmm. And again, I think, podcasts, it's great storytelling. Again, you're a shining example of someone who just started this on a probably on a bit of a lark and see where it would go. But it's great content, and I probably spend I would say probably 15 to 20% of my time consuming media now is on podcasts, where I would say probably 24 months ago it'd be about 5%.
Well, it's interesting you say it, and you're absolutely right, because I just started this project as a result of the pandemic, like people wanting to hear what sports media people are doing and their careers. And like, I just think of myself, if these weren't pandemic times, I'd be covering sports. I'd be out in the field getting my reps that way. And definitely a lot of the established reporters would be as well. So they probably wouldn't have the time to come on a podcast. So as much as the pandemic hasn't been, great, there are silver linings. And I just think it presents unique opportunities for young journalists to create content, because when sports come back and you're hitting the ground running, I think people are going to remember, someone like, myself or others who are producing content being like, hey, like they're finding creative ways when there's no sports to be producing engaging content.
Yeah, and I think the one thing, Lucas, is that your generation is certainly has a larger need to be tech savvy and be able to adapt quickly to things like TikTok when it comes along, and Snapchat. Again, I mean, TikTok, I would suggest 6 months ago, I certainly hadn't heard of TikTok. And it's one of the reasons why when I was sports at the Globe and Mail back in the early 2000s, that after 8 years, I had decided that I needed a change, and I kind of saw the writing on the wall where the business was going from a digital standpoint. And I thought, boy, if I can get my feet wet and get a little bit more savvy on the technical side, it might open some doors for me down the road, because it still felt like I probably had a good 10 years left in my full-time career. And we had a job opening at the Globe for a daytime sports editor for globesports.com. And so it gave me an opportunity to transition over the sports editor's role, do the online gig and get some experience. And that played a large role in Yahoo hiring me to lead the Canadian sports property in 2010.
Well, we're going to get into a couple of those stops, because I'm fascinated about some of the work that you did there. But I kind of want to start with what you're doing now, Steve, particularly at Hip Check Media, because it sounds very fascinating. And I think a lot of people that are in media and communications, they're trying to figure out, okay, how can I add value? What certain things can I do? But the work that you're doing, working on behalf of, you've done work with the Canadian Olympic Committee, Athletics Canada, NBA Canada, youth sports. So maybe just describe some of the tasks and your role at Hip Check Media.
Yeah, so Hip Check Media's involved a little bit right now for both myself and Colin Campbell, my partner, Lucas. I had an opportunity about 18 months ago to move back to Kincardine and take a contract to work in the corporate affairs department of Bruce Power, the nuclear generating station that produces about a third of the electricity for Ontario. And it was just an opportunity. My wife's from Kincardine. I started my newspaper career at the Kincardine News back in 1981. We'd always talked about coming back up here eventually. So it really was an opportunity for us to get up here, get settled a little bit before I retired. My wife was an ultrasonographer for 30 years in Brampton, so she retired last fall. So Hip Check's on a bit of a hiatus right now, but again, it was, we talk about podcasts and storytelling and video, and that's the reason why Colin and I started Hip Check in 2016 after I left Yahoo and Colin had been working at the NHLPA, is that we thought there was an opportunity and a need for sports federations, especially in Canada, where a lot of our national sport federations don't have the funding to have a communications team or even a dedicated communications manager. And we really thought we could come in and help them tell the stories around their athletes and their programs, really focusing on video and taking some long form video and then putting it in chunks to distribute on social media. And so we had a little bit of success, and we did some work for the Hill Academy, helping them with a social media strategy, and we did a little bit of work for the Canadian Junior Hockey League, and again, the Canadian Olympic Committee. We did a lot of work with the Facebook and Twitter accounts for some of their leadership during the games in Korea in 2018, and again, kind of working with the COC's photographers and a translator to get that content out. So it's something that when my contract at Bruce Park expires in December, and it's it's probably something that Colin and I are going to pick up again, and I'm excited about that.
So without giving away all the state secrets, but let's say you have a company, one of these companies, they come to you, and you sort of alluded to it a bit earlier about what you were helping them with, but what was their biggest need or demand in order to enhance their profile of what they were trying to produce?
Really content, Lucas. And the unfortunate part is that those federations, so many of them are running on shoestring budgets. And even Colin and I have a lot of experience, but we understand the federations aren't well funded, and we were trying to provide them a service that wouldn't cost them a lot of money, and it was a struggle. And I think that's one of the frustrations if you're a young person getting in this business, is that these federations desperately need the content. They don't do nearly a good enough job promoting their athletes, and I'm sure you've heard the stories about when Olympic athletes or Olympic federations say, well, nobody cares about us until every 4 years happens. And that is true. I mean, some of it is the media's fault, but some of it is also the fault of federations because they don't do a good enough job outside that fourth year of promoting their athletes and what they're doing with their competition and what the federations are doing with their programs.
No, I definitely agree. I mean, I attend Centennial College's graduate sports journalism program, and one of its big focuses is on Paralympic sports. And we did a lot of work with the Canadian Paralympic Committee at the beginning this year before the postponement of 2021. And just speaking with them and so many of these athletes who were so grateful to just student journalists to promote their stories. And it just definitely gave, sort of insight and perspective about, what a lot of these federations and entities have to go through because, they need the content, but they need help with that and because they just don't have the resources.
Yeah, and again, Lucas, to do the content properly, it's not just as simple as going on an Instagram account and shooting some video and putting up an Instagram story. I mean, I think Tony Ambrosio talked about this on an earlier podcast with you, is that the storytelling is an art form, and you get better at it over time. And I think Tony made a great point about how every athlete has a great story to tell. And I would say that Tony mentioned Olympic athletes, but I would say if you're any kind of a high performance athlete, be it at the high school level or as an Olympic competitor, you have a good story to tell, whether it's the influence that your parents have had on you or a great coach that you had, or how you overcome some barriers to get to where you are today. But as you know, from talking to people and from the experiences you've gone through with the journalism program at Centennial, it takes time to really get those principles down pat and to learn how to be a really good storyteller.
No doubt. And especially in the social media age where a lot of times your brand, like that's where your brand is projected, whether it's on Instagram, Twitter. And I know from personal experience, like when I first started on Twitter, okay, you have about a couple hundred followers, but you need to put the work in order to sort of solidify your voice. And even I'm still developing that as a young person, trying to figure out, okay, what works, what doesn't work with my audience. So, and I'm just a one-man show at the moment. So like, I can't even imagine the struggle and difficulty of organizations to try to do that really, really well.
Yeah. And it's a fine line, Lucas. Again, you talk about young journalists. It's a really fine line with social media now. I mean, back in my day, you weren't a columnist coming out of journalism school. You went and you learned how to be a reporter, and you got some experience, and you became more educated and more learned. And at some point, they gave you a column when you had enough information that you were able to write. You were able to write opinion or analysis pieces, but you were able to do it from a place where you had a lot of knowledge. I think that's one of the dangers with young journalists today is Twitter is an open forum for them to express opinions. but they haven't had those life experiences, or they haven't spent a lot of years covering a sport. And again, I probably sound like an old fart saying this, but
No,
I
it's
do.
true.
It goes back to the brand as well. If you're someone who's very opinionated on Twitter as a young journalist, that there's a chance that's going to come back to bite you at some point. And I've especially seen that lately with what's going on in the U.S. right now with the George Floyd murder and some of the conversations around diversity and race. And so if you're a young journalist, you really do have to be careful and be mindful of who you're speaking to on those social media platforms.
Well, I think too, Steve, I think it's, also, this notion of, okay, the amount of followers I have, the amount of likes and retweets I get. I mean, it may not necessarily be the right perfect thing. And I think for young journalists who are trying to get hired, trying to get employed, employers are looking at, journalists and evaluating talent constantly. I don't, if you're comparing two people, okay, maybe, this person, has about 1,000 followers, but does really, really good work. Then, the person with 5,000 followers, but it's all, it's laden with profanity and, it's hot takes and all this sort of stuff. I'm going to probably hire the person with 1,000 followers because I know once he has that platform, he can then grow compared to the person who's, just off the rails, so to speak.
Yeah, and this is like most industries, Lucas. This industry is very driven on relationships, and I would say I've had a lot of jobs in my career. I probably have worked at 9 or 10 different places over 4 decades, and I would say 80 to 90% of the jobs I've got I got my foot in the door because of a relationship I had. You still have to win and prove that you can do the job, and I'm proud of the career that I've had, but it's based on relationships. And the one thing that does concern me right now is I do see young journalists coming out of university going on Twitter and slamming, thinking that quote old school media haven't done a good enough job covering a certain topic and that. And at the end of the day, it's still old school media types like me who are sports editors and managing editors and running newsrooms. And as you mentioned, if it comes down to, if you're a guy who's been a bit of a poop disturber on Twitter, and you have an interview with Bart Yapsley at Sportsnet, you're reducing your chances of getting hired.
No doubt. But I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about your career because of all the stops that you've been on, and you graduated from Ryerson Polytechnical Institute, which is now Ryerson University, for those of you who don't know, way back when. But, Steve, did you always want to get into sports media, or did you want to get into the communications, public relations side? Like, what was sort of your journey to sports media?
Yeah, it's funny, Lucas. I'll try not to be too long-winded, but when I decided pretty early. I knew in grade 10 that I wanted to be a sports writer, and it's funny. I remember now. I grew up in a little town in Eastern Ontario called Prescott, and we had a daily paper, the Brockville Recorder and Times. And I remember I have scrapbooks where I used to cut out the articles like Canadian Press, NHL roundups, and stories on the Brockville Braves Tier 2 hockey team, and I would paste them in this scrapbook. And I was a voracious reader back then. I think I read Stan Mikita's autobiography about 27 times, but taking out the Prescott Library. But when I graduated from Ryerson, I did have an interest in getting into communications, and I applied for, I think I sent application letters and resumes to every team in the OHL. And at that time, I think the OHL might have had one or two communications people in the league, and the one guy was a fellow, I think his name was John Thompson, with the Kitchener Rangers. And John was the director or manager of business operations, and communications was part of his job. So I got a lot of rejection letters. I did actually I had an interview. The Belleville Bulls were getting an expansion team that year. They were moving. I think they were moving the Guelph franchise to Belleville. So I actually took the train from Toronto down to Belleville and interviewed with Larry Mabedy and two of the team's owners for a communications job there. But they end up hiring somebody else. So I knew I wanted to work in sports. I wasn't a good enough athlete to play in the NHL or play on the PGA Tour, but I knew I wanted to have a career in sports somehow.
And you started with media relations manager with the NHLPA. You were the director of communications at Tennis Canada, and it's interesting, those jobs, because I feel like today those job titles, I'm sure it was challenging back then, but I feel like it's even more challenging today because of the social media element that we talked about earlier, where these entities, if something goes awry, and God forbid it does, they may have a more difficult job controlling the narrative compared to, back when you were a director of communications or a media relations manager. Am I on the right track or way off base there?
Yeah, no, I think it can work both ways, Lucas. I think, especially with the shrinking in media, you can often create your own narrative by social media. Whether if you get the president of Tennis Canada, for example, to write a column on and put it on LinkedIn, or if you're able to react quickly with a statement, I think you can be proactive. But at the same time, it's hard to build an audience, and I still believe people would rather hear from Stephen Brunt than Steve McAllister putting something on 140 characters on Twitter. The one thing I will say is if I was working as a communications director at a sports federation today, social media would be a critical part, and I would go out and find the best young person I could who knows social media inside and out, who's willing to keep on top of the trends, as you mentioned earlier, and could pump out content. I think that's one thing that's changed is media, sports media now, whether you're a reporter or a sports editor or a broadcaster or working for a league or a club, it's a 24/7 job now. And if you're a director, it does make it a little bit hard to do long-term planning and do big picture type stuff when you kind of do have to have your head in the weeds of social media every day.
And you mentioned earlier about relationships, and I've interacted with media relations managers about credentials or to different initiatives and learning about different players and whatnot, and they're so vital, whether it's a director of communications at Rogers Cup for Tennis Canada or an NHL event during these big events where media congregates. So I'm just curious, were those two experiences vital for you to build a lot of those long-lasting relationships for your career?
Yeah, and again, I would say it worked both ways for me, Lucas. I think working in the media, I met obviously worked alongside a lot of reporters. So when I did move over to the communications and public relations side, I had those relationships, which made it a lot easier for me when I picked up a phone and might have to have a difficult phone call with somebody. The reason I got the job with the NHLPA was I'd left Canadian Press after covering the Blue Jays World Series championship in 1993. And about a year after that, I was at Tennis Canada, and I got a phone call from Bob Goodnow one day. And Bob was executive director of the PA at that time. And I thought Bob was calling looking for tennis tickets for the tournament. And it turned out he had been speaking with Alan Adams, who was the hockey writer for CP at the time, and someone with whom I'd worked for 5 years. And Bob said he really needed to have a communications person because they were about to enter a labor shutdown, a lockout in the fall of 1994, and he needed someone who could deal with the media on a daily basis. And Al put my name forward. So that's how that job came about. And I worked twice at Tennis Canada, and again, I worked on the flip side when I was a reporter at the Etobicoke Guardian, and then at CP in the late 80s, early 90s. I got to know Tom Manek, who was the head of communications at Tennis Canada at the time. And Tom and I often had conversations about me coming and working at Tennis Canada at some point. And sure enough, in 1993, there was an opening for me at Tennis Canada, and I joined Tom there. So yeah, it does work both ways, and it's not always easy. Sometimes when you're a communications director, you deal with challenging situations and people that might be your friends in the media. You can't tell them certain things, or you might not be happy with what they write, and you have to have a conversation. So it's not a lot of fun. But again, I would say I feel pretty fortunate that most of the friendships I've had over my career, I've been able to maintain regardless of what side of the fence I've been working on.
Yeah, and speaking of tennis, I've grown up a tennis fan all my life. I mean, the first ever live sporting event I ever went to was the Rogers Cup back in 2003, and had the chance to cover the Rogers Cup last year. And it's just amazing how that sport has grown. And I'm sure for you, when you were the director of communications at Tennis Canada, like just the amount of attention now because of course, the great Canadian players that, we have, Bianca Andreescu, Denis Shapovalov, Felix Auger-Aliassime, etc. But I just think, again, more younger people are getting involved, and Tennis Canada is, doing a lot of, unique ways to produce content. And I think it's one of the things that those individual sports have to be able to do for a younger audience is find those ways to create the content to bring new, younger fans to the sport.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, Tennis Canada, they're one of the 3 or 4 best funded programs in the country because of the 2 Rogers Cup tournaments. So they do have the financial resources to hire some social media people, and I know that Ben Makarenko, who does marketing at the Toronto office, has been able to get some video support and produce some videos and send staff to Davis Cup ties and also be able to hire like Tom Tebbett, who's covered tennis for half a century. So when you have the financial resources, that's the kind of compelling content you can do. And it's great that we're in an era here where you have these great players like Auger-Aliassime and Shapovalov and Raonic and hopefully Bouchard's going to come back at some point, and Andreescu, where you have this great crop of Canadian players right now, and most of them are social media savvy, and Tennis Canada, I think, has done a pretty good job taking advantage of that.
So how do you then end up at the Globe, Steve? And it must have been quite an exciting time to be at the Globe, because a lot of, some of the top journalists like Stephen Brunt, Michael Grange, were there at the time. So I'm just curious how you ended up becoming the sports editor at the Globe and Mail.
Yeah, just plain dumb luck, Lucas. That's not really true. Neil Campbell, who was a sports editor at the Globe at that time, Neil and I had covered baseball together in the early 90s. And again, it's funny, I was living in Brampton, Neil was in Mississauga, and Neil didn't have his driver's license back then. And so I would pick up Neil at his condominium at Square One during Jay's homestands, and we would drive to the ballpark together and drive back after the games. And we became, Neil's one of my best friends in the business. And I think a guy who doesn't get enough credit, Neil's probably the most underrated sports journalist that I've ever experienced in the country. Just a smart guy. He was a great sports journalist. But Neil was the guy who put together that department at the Globe in the late 90s, and he was moving over to the online. Neil, again, he was ahead of his time, saw how digital was going to be relevant down the road. So he left the sports editor's job to run globemail.com in 2000, just around the time of the Sydney Olympics. And so Neil recommended me to Richard Addis, who was the editor-in-chief at the Globe at the time. And you're absolutely right, Lucas. I moved into just an incredibly terrific situation with what I still believe is the best sports department in the country at any time, I think, in my career. Just so much talent, and I know I'm going to forget some names, but Brunt and Grange and Dave Schultz, and I brought in Tim Hornsby. We had Eric DeHatchik and Alan Mackey in Calgary, and Jeff Blair covering baseball in Toronto, and just a really smart group, and a group that really worked well together. Bill Houston, Bill Houston had a lot of detractors in the Toronto and the Canadian sports media industry, but Truth and Rumors was the most read column in the country at that time. I really enjoyed that job. I loved going into work every day, and I would talk to Brunt at like 8:30 every morning. We talked about what was going on that day. just Dave Naylor's another guy who was at the Globe when I was there. Neil put together a great team, and I'm really proud of the work that group did during my 8 years in that job.
And it just shows you the caliber of those journalists that even past the Globe, they could still find jobs in the industry. Well, definitely different from, working at a newspaper. It again just shows the times, right? Like, you look at Michael Graves, Stephen Brunt, Jeff Blair, they go to Sportsnet. Sportsnet then becomes a lot more multi-platform. So it's just sort of, it's interesting and sad in a way, because look, the Globe was, sports section with, like you said, it was huge at the time. It was across the country, and then it's just sadly diminished just because of the nature of the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's sad. Like I'm a Globe alumnus. I always will be. I love the newspaper. Phil Crowley is the paper's publisher. Is one of the best people I've ever worked for. And yeah, you're right. I feel bad for the people who are still there today, and because of the department is a shell of itself, what it was at that time. As far when you mentioned the people who moved to Sportsnet, I mean, I think Stephen Brunt was really a trendsetter. Brunt was one of the guys who identified early that you could not just be a sports writer, that you could do some radio and do some television. And of course, Stephen's written a ton of sports books.
Yep.
But Stephen started that kind of wave of people who started getting on doing radio, and Neil, to his credit at the time, did a really smart thing where we bought some airtime on the Fan 590 every morning, and every morning during the week we would have a different sports writer on the morning show talking about what they were writing, and I think that was a great marketing ploy for our department. So yeah, it's really neat. It's got absolutely nothing to do with me. I had no influence on these guys, but it is fun to see what Michael and Jeff Blair and Brunt and Dave Naylor and these guys have been able to cross over and be successful on other platforms.
And for you then go from the Globe to Yahoo Sports, and I know we talked a little bit about off the air with your relationship with Tony Ambrosio, and that's where you got to work with him with the Olympic coverage. So I'm just curious what that was like, because I mean, Yahoo back in the late 2000s, early 2010s isn't near what it was today in terms of sports coverage and what it's doing in sports media.
Yeah, well, Yahoo Sports was again. It was funny, Lucas. I almost feel like I had the last 15 years of my journalism career were incredible at a time when the industry was kind of going the other way. But when I joined Yahoo and right before the Olympics in December 2009, a guy named Dave Morgan, who had been the assistant sports editor at the Los Angeles Times, he had basically built this empire in the U.S. with Yahoo Sports because of fantasy sports. And Dave was one of the architects of bringing all these sports bloggers on board. Mm-hmm. And I think the fellow named Jamie Mottram, who was heavily involved with that. Another guy named Mark Pezzavento, who now works for the NFL on the content side. And then what Morgan also did is he went out and kind of cherry-picked the best sports columnists in the country. So he went out and got Dan Wetzel and Adrian Wojnarowski and a guy named James Black and Johnny Ludden, who was covering the San Antonio Spurs for one of the papers in Texas. And it was almost like a super sports department. And the Canadian property, the leadership in Toronto, they made the decision in 2009 that they wanted to try to follow the lead of what was going on in the U.S. and hire more journalists and invest in blogs. And that's why they brought me on board to build that team. So again, I had a chance to go to 3 Olympics with Yahoo, which was one of those things on my bucket list as a sports media person. And working just with some really, really smart people. And also at the time, it was fun to see Adrian Wojnarowski, and Adrian was kind of one of the first. He and Bob McKenzie were probably the first 2 real superstars on Twitter. And I learned a lot about the digital side working with Greg Wyshynski, who was running Puck Daddy at that time on Yahoo Sports. And Greg and I became really good friends. And like I said, just learned a lot watching the way Greg and his team of bloggers would jump on stories got a real appreciation for what Greg did at a time when Greg couldn't get credentials in every NHL arena. One of the things I had to fight for when I got there was they thought that Greg was a blogger and they didn't want sports bloggers in the press boxes back then. And I remember flying down to Montreal 2 or 3 times to meet with Donald Beauchamp, who was the vice president of communications for the Canadiens back then, and explain to him why Greg was relevant and why Greg should be treated just like any other journalist.
Was that a challenge for you, like early on? Because it sort of was a time, from what I can remember, where blogs were certainly prevalent, but not as, institutionalized or as they are now. So from the digital side, you were sort of at the tip of the iceberg where it was completely sort of going over and becoming full digital, the sports media world.
Yeah, I had some mixed feelings, Lucas, because blogs were kind of seen, like mainstream media people tended to, back then it was a stereotype of the blogger sitting in his basement in his boxer shorts and tank top with a bag of chips filled on the floor and empty Coke cans all over the place. And so, you kind of break down that myth a bit, but then, and also there was some, I think, a little bit of resentment at the time that bloggers would seize a piece, someone would break a story and a blogger would grab it. Mm-hmm. Where, if you look at newspapers, one of the things I'm most proud about working at the Globe Mail was if we got scooped in a story, whether you were the ROB section or the news section, the entertainment section, or the sports section, when you walked into the newsroom the next day, is the mantra was, how are we going to take control of the story? How are we going to, take that scoop the Toronto Star had and turn it into the Globe Mail story? So bloggers, and Wyshynski was great at this. I mean, Greg was a guy that could see something silly, a funny jersey and turn it into Jersey Fouls. But at the same time, he was a guy that if there was a trade or a situation like we have right now, where there's this great debate about NHL players and teams speaking out or not speaking out about racism in North America, Greg's a guy who could write very smartly and passionately about that subject. So, not all bloggers are in Greg's category, but I think there were a lot more out there than they were given credit for.
And as the managing editor of Yahoo, Steve, I'm you're obviously interacting with a lot of different talent and whatnot over the years. I'm just curious, when you evaluate talent, writing or broadcast or digital or, those areas, what are some of the traits that, people that worked for you, like, what were some of the traits that as saying, this person needs to come work for us because he's going to be a great journalist with our company?
Yep. I'm a big believer when you hire people, Lucas, the attitudes, it's top of mind. Like if I can take somebody who has a great attitude and teach them how to be a better reporter or teach them how to be a better writer. But if you're not willing to learn and you're not, being part of a media department, it's a team effort. And I think one of the reasons why I got along with people is because I was able. I wasn't beyond working a Saturday night shift at Yahoo if someone needed the weekend off, or when a big story broke. I remember I can't remember. It might have been the 2005, 2006 NHL lockout. Nick Kotsanika called me at like 5 o'clock in the morning from New York because the PA and the league had struck a deal, and I got up and got on my computer and updated the site. But I think that the attitude's the big thing. And then I think you have to, and this is something you and Tony talked about on that podcast with Tony Ambrosio, was being willing to learn and adapt. And, you might be doing a podcast today and you might be doing your own website 2 months down the road. And I think there are some common principles. I still think there's a ton of value into being a really good reporter. I think there's lots of people, Lucas, that can help you write. But the ability to be able to break news and get the right side of a story and to get that information, I think that's maybe become a bit of a lost art where we tend to react to things that we see or hear today and maybe we're losing a little bit of those great those really great reporters who can get the information.
Well, that whole aspect of, getting really good reporters is interesting. And I've been really following the sort of the quick ascension of the digital media outlet, The Athletic, which has really done a good job of sort of, recruiting, veteran journalists like Ken Rosenthal, Pierre LeBrun, et cetera, to then also giving younger journalists an opportunity to, show, break into the business. I know that James Myrtle is heading up, former Globe and Mail writer, heading up the Canadian operation. So I'm just curious, for you, someone who's worked in digital, the importance of those digital media outlets and the viability that they can have that long-term sustainability in an era where, like, let's face it, it's tough to find opportunities.
Yeah, well, you have to. If you work in the sports media industry, Lucas, you've got to be rooting for The Athletic, because they're doing, if you're someone who wants to be a writer, they're doing what a lot of media outlets aren't doing anymore. And the same thing was true with Sportsnet. I was a huge fan of what Sportsnet's been doing for the last, I guess, 15 years, because they went out and hired people like Michael Grange and gave, Michael a chance to write, and Shai Dabidi, and invested in writers, which a lot of newspapers weren't doing anymore. And The Athletic's done a great job. As you mentioned, I think there's just a great blend there. They've invested in some investigative journalism and long-form writing with people like Dan Robson. Really smart to get guys like Jack Han and Justin Bourne and the other people that they have writing about analytics and writing about, looking at the game differently than a Pierre LeBrun or Eric DeHatchik might. But then having guys like Pierre and Eric and other, Lisa Dillman in Los Angeles and David Aldridge on basketball, and hiring experienced journalists who have great sources and also have this great memory where, a guy like Eric can, if you ask Eric about the 1989 Calgary Flames, he could write 5,000 words in 2 hours for you. So there's an awful lot of there's a lot of value to having those kinds of people who have that deep wealth of knowledge.
I want to, wrap the conversation up with talking about the future, and certainly, sports are probably going to make a return, sooner rather than later, hopefully with, very, very soon, but it's going to look different. It's going to look different without fans for the short term. And there's a lot of conversations now about, how broadcasts are going to look. And I'm just curious, your opinion on what sort of these media entities, the challenges they're facing right now. Take the NHL, for example, and their return to action, or the NBA in trying to show a really unique product, but trying to embrace the challenges that are definitely going to exist for the time being, with no fans, probably remote broadcasts, etc.
Yeah, it's going to be, it'll be interesting, Lucas, in terms of, with what this pandemic's done, and when you are able to open arenas again, most likely you're not going to have 20,000 people in an NHL arena, or you're not going to have 70,000 people at a Buffalo Bills game. So is there an opportunity to reinvent the wheel and on the fan experience? Because I think we are at a point now where these leagues are in real danger of pricing out their fans. And I read somewhere, it might have been Jonah Siegel, Toronto Sports Media, wrote last week about how, it's easier for me now. If when I was living in Caledon, it's easier for me to sit in my living room and be 10 feet away from my fridge and 20 feet from the bathroom and sit there on my recliner and watch a baseball game than to spend $150 and drive downtown to the Sky Dome and pay $25 for parking and $13 for a beer. And I can see the replays 20 times from home if I like what Jamie Campbell and Joe Siddle and Hazel May are doing. I can enjoy their commentary or listen to the guys on the radio. So I think they've got to figure out the fan experience, not just from a price point, but also taking advantage of all the technology and the innovation that's available there now, to make sure that if I am paying $150 to go watch a game, that I'm getting an incredible experience for that. And then I think the other thing is, there is a danger, as much as you get people who say they'd be better off not having media. That's just not true. At the end of the day, you need media to shine a light on your product and on your people. And it's great that clubs and leagues can hire writers and video producers and that. But I'm still a big believer that it's going to be more difficult for leagues to move along if they don't have meaningful media coverage.
And finally, Steve, for young journalists, breaking into this industry, I know that you've had the chance to work with, different media companies and a lot of, young journalists. And how important is the whole concept of being multi-platform, being able to do a lot of the different skills? Because I know for me, it's Centennial being, you got to learn all these different skills and tools in the toolbox, because that's how you're going to get hired, I feel like, in today's sports media industry climate.
Yeah, I still think you have to have that X factor, Lucas. So there's got to be something that makes Lucas Weiss stand out from Steve McAllister, and it's whether it's that you're a great reporter or a great photographer, or you're an incredible writer. There's got to be something that makes you stand out. I think today you have to be a bit of a generalist. Like, you have to know how to use your phone and take video and take pictures and post to channels and monitor social media and that. But there are lots, as you know, there's lots of people out there, Lucas. I mean, you're probably part of a very good group of young people at Centennial. And I saw the same thing teaching. I've taught at Ryerson. I've taught the College of Sports Media. And every year you would see, I would say, 12 to 20 really smart people who you thought were going to have a really successful career in this industry. But you do have, there's something about those 12 to 20 people that stands out. They were a good writer, or they really know how to communicate with people. You maybe watch them produce a highlight show, and you really like the way they manage the team. So you have to have that wow factor, I believe, in one area that, again, that's going to be the thing that makes you stand out in a job interview, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, it's, a lot of, I've had a few guests on, and it's always interesting to sort of create, what are sort of like the connecting themes, of all the different guests. And definitely that X factor, that, that work ethic. Like, I think people sort of say, wow, work ethic, but no, you got to work your butt off, and eat, breathe, and live sports, and covering it and reporting it. It's not just about the box score or the outcome or the travel and all that stuff. It's about telling stories. And that's why I'm involved in sports media, and why I want to have a career in it, because storytelling, people love the stories. And to me, whether it's about an athlete, whether it's about a coach, whether it's about winning a championship or heartbreak, people will always go to those stories. It's just the medium might be different, but I always believe that there will be a demand for sports and a demand for the really good storyteller.
Yeah, and if I can add one thing too, Lucas, and that's something I always talk about with my students, is you have to be able to write. Even if you want to be the next Bob McCowan, or you want to be the next Bob Cole or Jim Houston, you have to write, because you're going to have to write a covering letter. You're going to be writing on Twitter or social media channels. And if I see Lucas Weiss on Twitter and he's got spelling mistakes all over the place, and I get a resume from you, and your cover letter has, you don't indent paragraphs properly, and again, you spell my name wrong, and you don't know what my title is. Writing is still a very important art, regardless of where you're going to work in this industry. So that's the one thing I will tell people. I know not everybody wants to be a writer. I mean, people want to be play-by-play announcers, or they want to be producers or directors. But a lot of times when you're trying to get your foot in the door, it's going to be through the written word.
And not just on print, but digital, social media, like you said, all those facets. And, it's one of the pillars I think of being, successful in this industry. And, you got to have it, because I think, you're right. though those spelling mistakes on a resume, they may seem small, but they point to credibility, especially in the hiring process. And in such a cutthroat business, you got to be perfect in those areas and to impress employers.
Yeah, and it's a really competitive business, Lucas. The one thing I will say is that a lot of us moan and groan about the state of the industry, but I've never been more bullish on the caliber of talent that's coming out, and I think that's the one. I really wish I was 40 years younger, because I would have loved to have been able to go through a sports media program at Centennial or Ryerson or the College of Sports Media. And again, I really enjoyed the opportunity to teach, because I met so many good young people. I mean, Israel Fear, who's at The Athletic now, Israel was a student of mine at the College of Sports Media, and Faisal Kamisa at Sportsnet was one of my students in Israel's class. And there's a young guy, Alex DeDaisy from Ryerson, who kind of established his brand as a sports photographer, covering university sports during his time at Ryerson. And Alex is doing social media at Sportsnet now. Victor Finley's the guy I taught at Ryerson for a semester, who's kind of carved out a niche covering university hockey, and he's starting to get some opportunities to do some play-by-play work, that's what his dream is. So there are a lot of young talented people who want to work in sports media, and there are going to be opportunities, because I see those people get hired. So the one thing I would tell yourself and your friends and other people in the industry is that if you do work hard and have that work ethic that you mentioned, there are going to be opportunities for a long time to work in this industry and do what you love to do.
Steve McAllister, he's not only a highly accomplished journalist and a communications expert, but he wins the Best Background Award for all my guests by far. So, Steve McAllister, thank you so much for joining me today and providing all his helpful insight on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles.
Great. Thank you, Lucas. I really enjoyed this.